Are you American? I had to drag Christianity out of him just a minute ago. Are you American?
That's not what happened. No, what happened.
Did you watch the Stacey Abrams?
I have to worry about myself. I don't have I can't guarantee my physical or spiritual health if I watch that. Awesome.
It was so funny. You should see Paul. Dying laughing.
The underside of my legs hurts too bad. Hurts too bad. It's like off balance.
Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. All the pre-class socialization's done. Yes, Ben.
Oh, okay.
It was just supposed to be like a one question.
It was kind of a joke. But I think that more.
Hold that thought, Ben.
This is so great.
It's got so we can hurt. It's got
It's just a series title.
Large fries. Large fries.
Why would you do that? Why would they do that?
McDonald's is so
No, it does. It doesn't. I mean,
We're up
red herring.
Nuggets are coffee. The nuggets are
They're
better.
wonderful. That's nuts. But not this.
Nuggets are, they're nuggets are
That's
better.
crap. And that's like the whole movie with the main character. Was a result.
No, their chicken sandwiches are so good. I did nuggets, but I still bang. Yeah, come on.
Okay. Respect other people.
You only put McDonald's.
I swear, I can text it.
First of all, McDonald's is very
I'm not reading it.
No, we still need to do that.
I'm not gonna say you're lying. When you guys like to do
Because sure, he has red hair.
I have that on video.
No, I ordered.
Actually, no, they're not.
All right, Ben. You ready for it? Hey, hold up. Nice.
So if NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization,
Yeah.
then what does NASCAR stand for?
I do know. I do know this. North American Stock Car. I've heard of it before, but let's do it stock cars. Auto racing, North American Stock Car Auto Racing.
Yeah, I think we should look it up.
NASCAR? No. Okay. Ben, I guess that was an okay question to start U.S. history because it kind of related to NATO, but not really. All right. Is this the last thing we did? Okay. So,
Yeah.
wow, awful chattery today. So we know now that Japan, and because of their alliance with Germany, they have awakened the sleeping giant. Tisk, tisk, right? America was trying to stay out of the war. In fact, America was trying so hard to stay out of the war that even as tensions were brewing in Europe, in 1937, America passed a law. The Congress of America and the President signed a law called the Neutrality Act of 1937 to not only remind ourselves, but to tell the world we are not getting involved in your war over there again. Remember, we tried to stay out of World War I, and we did for 3 years. So we don't want to get involved. We passed a law that says we will not provide any country, whether we are friendly with you or not. American companies are prohibited against the law to supply any nations at war. Pretty strong, right? It's a pretty strong statement to tell the world that we are neutral. Well, as things get a little more heated, actually a lot more heated, because now in 1939, World War II begins. So America is put into a corner now when it comes to their own thoughts about this war. Like, how strongly are we going to hold ourselves to this principle of neutrality? We don't want to get involved. We don't want to get involved with it started. Uh-oh. What if Hitler wins? We have to change our law. We have to pass another law in 1939. Because if we kept the original law in 1937, what's that mean? If Britain needs our help with military supplies, are we allowed to do it? No. So they had to pass another law. It's called the Neutrality Act of 1939. Well, how's the law work, right? The most recent law trumps the previous law. You understand that, right? Like, you can't go back and say, hey, that law in 1937 says we're not allowed to sell arms to any nations. No, the next law, 1939, trumps the previous law. So when the Neutrality Act of 1939 comes out, there's a catch to it, though. Now, why did they put this catch in there? Obviously, when they wrote the law, it's much longer than this, right? I've made it very small for you. They allow cash and carry arms sales. In other words, we are not allowed to sell arms and ammunition to other countries, even if they're at war. First of all, I already explained why we had to do that. Because the Nazis need to be defeated. And if Americans, even though we don't want to send troops there, if Americans don't supply Great Britain and France with help, there's a good chance the Nazis are going to take over all of Europe. Well, we already saw, right, that they basically did. They were stopped 2 key times. But this time there was a stipulation. Do you understand what the phrase cash and carry means? Think back to what happened in World War I. We talked about it in World War I. We talked about it in the 1930s. We talked about it like when the Depression hit. It was one of the things that was maybe making the Depression even harder for America. Cash and carry, as opposed to I walk into a store, I give them cash, I carry the product out. What's another way I can go into the store and take it out? Credit. We can't trust them to say, buy now, pay later. What happened in World War I? We got all the way to the Great Depression. They stole us billions, right? Well, we had to be gracious. They were still rebuilding Europe. We can't just demand the money from them, right? You know, you loan your friend money, you want it back, but then your friend tells you, I got to feed my kid today. What kind of mean-spirited person says, I don't care, give me the money, right? So we were very gracious through the 20s and getting our money back. Well, then the Depression hit. Well, hey, we need the money now. We can't get in that situation again. So the law was passed that we can provide our friends with munitions, but you got to pay up front. We're not going to do that again. Make sense? So right now we're still in the phase of neutrality, but we do realize we have to help our friends. We can't let the Nazis win until Pearl Harbor. and Pearl Harbor. Oh, by the way, before this, right, the year before Pearl Harbor, FDR, the guy we talked about through the 1930s with the New Deal, the alphabet agencies and the government, the hyper government spending that started in the 1930s. That last question on your last test, that was a short answer question. It was like, hey, what changed in the 30s? How did America's attitude towards government intervention change in the 30s? Well, with FDR, and because of the Depression, America, quote unquote, cried uncle. Some of you put that in your answer. Cried uncle and said, you know what? We like to live by the principles of free market and the government not getting involved, but man, right now we need help. So we relented and we allowed the government to help. And since then, we've relied more and more and more on government intervention and help. Why is this word italicized? That wasn't on accident. And if you didn't notice it was italicized, now you do. Why do I got that word in italics? Come on. Sid.
Because George Washington only served 2 terms, so you don't want to pass him up.
The first president in our history is running, first of all, even running for a 3rd term, because the precedent, C-E-D, the precedent was set by the first and greatest president that 2 terms is enough. You're a public servant. You're not a king. You're not all powerful. 8 years is plenty of time. If you go longer than that, people might start seeing you as like some king or something. So that's enough. And no other president challenged that idea. That was like a unwritten law. It wasn't a law, but it was unwritten. After this, they're going to make it a law. It's going to become an amendment. It was unwritten that you would not serve longer than George Washington. Who would have the audacity to think that they're greater than George Washington? So that kind of lived all the way into the 1900s. FDR gets elected for the 3rd time. And part of the reason was, okay, first of all, you had the audacity of him running for a 3rd term. Second, America still not quite out of the Depression. The economy is still not growing like it should, and like it had in history. And there's this war going on in Europe. The idea that you're going to change, this was the quote, don't change horses in the middle of the stream. What if, with all this going on in the war in Europe and how we're not in it, but we're kind of in it because we're helping them. What if we get, do we want to change presidents in the middle of something like that happening? Usually not, right? So that was the election of 1940, and we got so engrossed in this 2 years ago that you guys all now understand what the electoral map looks like. So just a quick look at the vote there. Wendell Willkie was the Republican guy. He got 22 million votes, so he was no slouch, but Roosevelt easily wins the popular vote by 5 million. And of course, blue is Democrat, red is Republican, and Roosevelt dominates. It's a electoral landslide. If you notice something interesting, still all the way up to 1940, I draw your attention to California, 22 electoral votes. It's all based on population, right? How many electoral votes in Ohio? Still 1940. Still way more people living in Ohio than California. Look at Florida. Ohio and Florida are similar now. Florida has more, slightly more, but only 7. Isn't Florida like one of the popular like if you guys are thinking a few weeks ago with the winter and the ice storms, and maybe you heard your parent, I can't stand these winters and they're going to move, right? Isn't Florida one of the popular ones they're going to move to? Texas, Florida, maybe California, Arizona, somewhere south. Ohio was still a pretty powerful state. It still is, actually, even with our declining population. So what that tells you is that Ohio's population, I think we're down to 17 electoral votes. So it's a pretty significant drop in 2 generations to lose that much electoral power. Any other comments, questions on that? Notice kind of culturally, there's that one section right there in the upper Midwest that We're voting for Wilkie, the Republican. What do you think? Hey, I'm not telling you there's a right answer. What's your thought? What might be the reason for that? What might be the reason that the upper Midwest, starting in Kansas through Nebraska, Iowa, those states in that section of the country that voted for the Republican, 1940. What do we associate that part of the country with? Yeah, the breadbasket, right? The Dust Bowl, it's our breadbasket. The farmers have been struggling since before the Depression, right? Now we've gone a decade into this depression and we're not out of it yet. They weren't voting for FDR anymore. Make sense? Okay, so America is at war. Here we go. So, where does the war begin for America? Well, if Pearl Harbor remember, my philosophy is never say easy. That was easy. I almost said this should be an easy question. So now that I said it, I said it. I shouldn't have said it. David, what ocean is Hawaii in? Are you looking at the map or can you just tell me off? It's in the Pacific Ocean, right? Because the whole idea of attacking Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was to gain control of that set of islands that America had control of, because the IJA, which stands for the Imperial Japanese Army, wanted to establish total dominance in the Pacific. So, boom, let's take out the most powerful country that would be a competitor with us in the Pacific, America. Let's take out their main naval base, except they didn't get aircraft carriers, which would be kind of like mobile bases, right? So if they were able to take out our aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor, wow, we would have been done, right? They would have had such a head start to get everything they wanted to get accomplished. They already have a head start, because from Pearl Harbor in Hawaii here, so Hawaii here, Pearl Harbor, they're going to head to the Philippines, another territory that America controls. America got control of the Philippines after something we didn't spend a whole lot of time on called the Spanish-American War, and that was when Teddy Roosevelt was in, the Rough Rider, Teddy Roosevelt, rugged guy. And we, because of that war, one of the things we got from it, from the treaty, was Spain was down in Cuba. Spain lost control of Cuba. Spain had to cede control of the Philippines to us. So we control that. So Japan's next target then is, boom, we're going to take the Philippines. Well, they've been gearing for this war, right? America just got slapped upside the head like, whoa, this is war now? We're not ready. So they go to the Philippines literally at the beginning of January 1st, and they quickly, in war terms, rather quickly capture the islands of the Philippines. And from this quick capture comes the world famous quote that was made famous again in the 1980s and 90s by Arnold Schwarzenegger in his movies, I'll Be Back. Well, he got that quote from General Douglas MacArthur, who, upon the Americans having to surrender the Philippines, they're getting crushed. They had to get out of there. There was no winning. So they're evacuating as many of the American troops off of the Philippines, and MacArthur tells the Americans and the Filipino people that are pro-American, I'll be back. And of course, he was telling that to the Japanese too, giving them hope that, we've lost this battle here, but we haven't lost the war. They caught us off guard. They had the advantage, but we will come back. And that leads to, after their quick victory, something that you may have never heard about, but you're going to hear about, something called the Bataan Death March. How many have heard of it? No one in here has heard of it. Well, the one thing you do know that came out of World War II is that Adolf Hitler, the evil, maniacal leader of Germany and the Nazis, was set on exterminating, literally as if they were subhuman, the Jewish people, right? And then ultimately anybody that wasn't part of his perfect Aryan race that he wanted to bring into existence. But something happened in the Philippines after they defeated our troops that there's a lot of people, and I know I have a relationship with one person that's in their 80s right now, and you talk about prejudice. This person still harbors a whole lot of hate for Japanese people. So if you've ever heard your great-grandparents or somebody, and they talk about this era of World War II, it seems like, man, why do you hate Japanese so much? Because of not only did they attack Pearl Harbor and get us into war, but there was a very gruesome, wars. Am I allowed to say hell now because of that one video? Wars HE double hockey sticks anyway, right? And you think in war there's no rules. Well, actually there are. The international community actually has rules for war. How many knew that? I mean, that's why they call them war crimes. You're like, wait, war crimes? You just go kill people. There's no rules. Yeah, there are rules. Because if the rest of the world sees you at war with another country and you do things that go beyond breaking stuff and strategically maybe killing people and taking them prisoner, that's one thing because it's strategy. But when you go to torturing people, no, that goes beyond this reality we have to live in this dark fallen world called war. That goes beyond, right? That's not just, hey, that's our territory. That's not just bombing that factory because you can make artillery there that you can use against us. When you start killing civilians or you start treating, there's rules for how you treat, you take prisoners. There's international community has come together and said, you have to treat your prisoners a certain way. Aren't you at least like a little bit happy about that? Like, there's the reality that we live in a evil, the reality, you're Christians. We live in a fallen world, right? Sin's always going to be with us. Christ said war is always going to be with us. We hate it, but it's true until he returns. But even in that we've, as a world community, said, there's certain things you're not allowed to do. And the Bataan Death March put the Allied troops, and about half of them were ours, through this. And I'm going to show you a couple of videos that kind of just hit the surface. I mean, you could read books and watch other videos about what happened to these men. But a lot of hatred for Japanese to this day.
In this week in military history, we explore the beginning of the Bataan Death March by thousands of U.S. prisoners of war after the Battle of Bataan in World War II. The strategic importance of the Philippines was that forces based there could control the sea routes between Japan and their newly conquered territories in Southeast Asia. Therefore, soon after their attack on U.S. military forces at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japanese forces attacked the Philippines. The attack overwhelmed the greatly outnumbered U.S. and Philippine forces which had withdrawn to the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor. The siege of Bataan began on January 1, 1942, and was the first major land battle for the United States in World War II. The force on Bataan numbered approximately 76,000 Filipino and American troops, many of whom were sick and starving due to the lack of supplies during the long siege. After 99 days, the American-led forces were on half rations due to poor planning and dwindling supplies. American General Edward King, commander of the Allied ground troops on Bataan, surrendered his outnumbered forces on April 9, 1942. After their victory,
Just that right there, if you're an American soldier, what just happened? What just happened in the last 3 seconds of the video? The American flag comes down and the Japanese flag goes up.
the Japanese military, who had underestimated the number of prisoners, forced the surviving U.S. and Filipino troops to march 16 miles over 6 days with no food or water to their place of internment. Those who fell or stopped were killed. Thousands of U.S. and Allied soldiers died during the forced march. Of the 22,000 soldiers captured by the Japanese, only about 15,000 would return to the United States. The Japanese used similar tactics on other prisoners of war during World War II. The survivors named it the Bataan Death March. News of the Americans' treatments by their Japanese captors was initially kept secret. However, details of the atrocity were released in January 1944 by the Roosevelt administration to reinvigorate the will to fight amongst the people of the United States. Join us next time.
So if you were listening carefully, before the week-long 60-mile hike, where the Japanese, like when they say they weren't giving them anything, no food, no water. How long can you last without water, right? You probably learn only a few days. Miraculously, some people last longer. They were given nothing. Did you notice that at the end of the battle, they were already on half rations? You know what that means? Like a soldier gets so much a day to give them energy to fight. Well, they already had to cut back and make it half of what they were getting. So after the 3-month-long battle, now the ones that are taken prisoner already, I mean, especially the last 3 weeks of the Battle of the Philippines, they were already basically barely surviving. And now they're going to make them march 60 miles because they're not going to waste their fuel, of course, and they don't care. They're going to make these men march 60 miles to Bataan or to another base. And if you get weak and fall out and hold, you're not gonna hold up the march. They just kill you right there on the spot. That's not even accounting for the 5,000 Americans that died. That's not accounting for what they did to the troops once they got to their camps. Again, you could read more about it, and I don't know. Sometimes you just like to avoid these things because who wants to get angry, right? And again, you can almost sympathize with your great-grandparents if they harbored these feelings for the Japanese because, again, and you notice at the end that, hey, we're in the war now because of Pearl Harbor, but there's still a lot of Americans like, oh, we really want to get involved in this? Well, the Americans then are going to use this, right? You might call it propaganda, but it happened. We're going to use what they did to our men to go to a fellow American and say, you mean to tell me you know what happened at Bataan and you're still against us going in there and crushing the Japanese? What kind of American are you if you're still going to be talking about America not getting involved? And then the next one is a kind of a personal account.
Marine Corporal Glenn McDowell from Urbandale was stationed at the Cavite Naval Base on
Whoops,
the Philippine
you probably want to see that, huh?
Glenn McDowell from Urbandale was stationed at the Cavite Naval Base on the Philippine Islands. Locked.
Yes. Come on.
Marine Corporal Glenn McDowell from Urbandale was stationed at the Cavite Naval Base on the Philippine Islands. Locked in a battle that would last 5 months, McDowell and his buddies soon came to the conclusion that no reinforcements were coming to their rescue.
We knew there was no way in 7 acres, after we'd heard what happened to Pearl Harbor, that we was going to get any help.
Eventually, the larger Japanese force prevailed, and a surrender by American troops in the Philippines was announced on April 9, 1942. McDowell fought on until May 6th.
I'll tell you, the most sick feeling you get when you look up and see Old Glory come down and a Japanese flag goes up, just makes you feel like a bunch of men without a home.
Army Corpsman Malcolm Amos of Afton was among those captured on April 9. He became one of the more than 75,000 Allied forces, including an estimated 12,000 Americans, who were forced to walk the 60 miles from the tip of Luzon Island to the American military base, Camp O'Donnell. For 6 days, the men marched north with no food or water on what became known as the Bataan Death March. Anyone who was injured, fell behind, or attempted to escape was killed. An estimated 10,000 men died. 5,000 of them were Americans.
When we got into Camp O'Donnell, the rice was moldy, full of bugs, maggots, all that kind of stuff. They cooked all that stuff up, and it was kind of like a porridge. And the guys looked at that, some of them looked at that, and said, well, I'm not eating that kind of crap. And they just took it and dumped her. And those people are still over there in the Philippines because they just starved to death because that's the only thing there was to eat.
Both McDowell and Amos eventually wound up at the Cabanatuan prison camp, but they didn't meet each other until years after the war. McDowell, seeing the high death rate and lack of medical attention available to the men, volunteered for work details away from Cabanatuan. The work details finally took him to the Palawan prison camp on Palawan Island, where he helped build an airfield.
We didn't classify. I'm Army or Marine. We were just all a bunch of good American fellas sticking together.
Starts to tear up there at the end. Awful. So your choice is to see this. They said the rice had mold growing on it already. There were bugs in it, and they would just cook it up and expect them to eat it. Oh, you don't want to eat it? And they just dump it on the floor and say, well, are you going to eat it or die? Apparently, some people chose starve to death. Huh? And that still doesn't give you the whole story. It still doesn't tell you the stories of like we hear about what happened to the Jews and the medical experiments that the Nazis did with the Jews. You hear similar stories of the Japanese doing that with our soldiers in the Philippines. The greatest generation. That's why they're called the greatest generation. What they had, this is right on the heels of the Depression. Imagine that. We think we got it bad, you know what I mean? Right? You're just coming out of this depression and you find yourself in the Philippines being treated like that. We owe a great debt to that generation. That takes us to what some call, well, it's at least in the Pacific Theater. By the way, when I say the word theater and history, we don't mean going to watch a movie. We mean an area of war, right? So this is called the Pacific Theater, the European theater, the Pacific Theater. It's the region that the war was fought in. So the Battle of Midway, how many have ever seen that movie? I saw I don't know if there might have been a Midway made before the one I saw. In the mid-70s, it was one of those movies that was like, hey, get this. Little before I was your age, when I was in middle school, the movies came out with surround sound, which means when you sat in there, you could it wasn't just like listening to this video, like the sound was like all around you. Of course, you don't even notice it now because it's normal. You would notice it if you didn't have a surround sound in your movies. And I think I told you about Star Wars, right? When Star Wars came out, that was we actually went on a field trip because if you look at the original Star Wars compared to the graphics in the new Star Wars movies, it's like, what? Not even close. But for us, in 1977, the original Star Wars with the holographs and all that stuff, that was something we've never seen before on film. Anyway, the Battle of Midway is the turning point in the Pacific Theater. And we're gonna talk about it in like 2 minutes. In June of 1942, so here we go. America, December 7th, 1941, bombed Pearl Harbor. 3 weeks later, the Japanese invade the Philippines. Later that, in the summer of 42, we're involved in this battle for Midway Island, and the leading, the admiral for the American forces there, Admiral Nimitz, leads us to victory over Japan. So the turning point, because we were attacked in Pearl Harbor with really no defense. We were defeated and had to surrender the Philippines. And now we're ready. And it's pretty short order, actually, if you think about it. How America went from surprise to not ready to facing an enemy that had been wanting this and ready for it for years. And in a matter of what? Months, we've got our Navy and Air Force ready to go and defeat that enemy. It's pretty amazing. At Midway, the Japanese lose over 3,000 men, 4 of their aircraft carriers, and hundreds of their aircraft. America, turning point, loses just 380 some men, only 1 of their carriers, and 144 aircraft. A decisive American victory. Battle of Midway, turning point in the what theater? Pacific Theater. I just thought of something kind of easy to remember. Turning point, Midway. We're midway through the story. The turn, get it? Japanese were winning. Midway. You get it, Dave?
Yeah, I get it.
Questions, comments? Anybody have stories that you were told by grandparents, great grandparents? Have you read before? Did Paul tell you? Stories of World War II and the Bataan Death March. And there was a whole generation of Americans that, again, they'd be in their 80s and 90s now, but still hold a grudge against the Japanese for the atrocities, especially in the Philippines. And then the fact that when we get to the end of the war, we'll find out because of that Bushido, because of that idea that they can never surrender and dishonor their emperor, that tens of thousands more American soldiers were being killed, even though everybody knew, including them, that the game was over. Picture it's 78-2 in a basketball game, and your team's losing 78-2, but you're just like viciously following the other team like you're going to come back and win. I mean, that's a very minor way to describe. It was 78-2. Japanese had no chance to win, but they wouldn't surrender. So we ended up having to make the choice to use the atomic bomb or have tens of thousands more Americans killed. Or baseball, you're losing 22-2, and you're going to take your frustration out and beam the other guy in the batter's box.
Or you put,
Keep your best pitcher
yeah,
in.
you put your,
You don't put your bench in.
you don't put a position player on the mound.
Everything I know about World War II, I learned from John Wayne.
Yeah, that's not bad.
My dad was kind of a John Wayne fan.
Yeah, mine too. Clint Eastwood too. Probably John Wayne more.
I like True Grit.
Yeah? About a fistful of dollars.
I like
How about, ready? Listen, don't say anything. Let's see if I can whistle. You know that movie? My kids couldn't stand when that movie came on because that was like a horror movie to them. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Clint Eastwood movie.
Hello, Mr. Franken.
Hello,
How are
I
you
love
today,
you.
Mr.
Won't you
Franken?
tell me your name?
He's a
Hello.
tattletale.
He's a tattletale?
He is a tattletale.
Why? What
I'm a
happened?
tattletale.
What's he gonna tell him?
He
How
already
am I a
told us.
tattletale?
Corinne's the one who broke it.
Something in music?
Corinne broke Mr. Kane's ruler. She hit me with it and it snapped in half.
See what happens when teachers like Mr. King, like to have a little fun, then the kids ruin it.
No, he wasn't in the room at the time.
I know, but he's got that laid back kind of. You know what I
Evan
mean?
and I were sword fighting before. Then Corinne got it. And
Uh-huh,
kept hitting
see?
people with it.
Especially you. Et tu, Brute?
Well, I didn't snap it.
Et tu, Brute? Brutus. Hey, look at It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Love to out there see the sunshine. I've got sunshine on a cloudy day. When it's cold outside.